The shriek of tortured steel was the only warning. Eleanor Weston was thrown from the hard plush of her seat, her hand flying out to brace against the window pane as the train car bucked and shuddered to a violent halt. Outside, the world was an endless canvas of scorched earth and bleached sky, the Wyoming sun a merciless eye in the vast, silent expanse. A thin film of dust, disturbed by the commotion, settled over everything, a fine, gritty powder that tasted of distance and finality. The conductor, a man whose face was a roadmap of worry, walked the aisle with a grim expression. A rail had warped in the oppressive summer heat. They were stranded, indefinitely. Copper Creek, the final destination printed on her ticket, was still a good 10 miles away, a distance that felt as vast as an ocean. Another passenger, a stout salesman with sweat beading on his brow, pointed a thick finger out the window. "There's a way station not 2 miles back. You could hire a buckboard there, miss, if you're in a hurry." Eleanor was in more than a hurry. She was running, not towards something, but away from the suffocating ghost of a life that was no longer hers. So she gathered her meager belongings, paid a boy to carry her heavy trunk, and walked the 2 miles under the blistering sun, the dust clinging to the hem of her dark traveling dress. The way station was little more than a stable and a saloon, smelling of horses, whiskey, and resignation. For an exorbitant price, a sour-faced man agreed to take her to Copper Creek. The ride was punishing. The buckboard rattled over the unforgiving terrain, each jolt a reminder of her precarious new reality. When the town finally appeared on the horizon, it offered little comfort. It was a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings huddled together against the vastness, as if for warmth. The main street was a wide ribbon of packed dirt, stirred into a constant, swirling haze by the relentless wind. As the driver reined the horses to a stop in front of the general store, the buckboard lurched one last time. It was the final straw for her worn leather suitcase. The clasp gave way with a sharp snap, and the case fell open, spilling its contents into the street. A book of sonnets, a small silver-backed brush, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The delicate, private artifacts of her life in the East lay exposed in the dirt, vulnerable under the hard, curious stares of the townspeople who had begun to gather. Her face burned with humiliation. She knelt, her gloved hands fumbling to gather her scattered possessions, each retrieved item feeling like a judgment. Then a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a man standing there. He was tall, dressed in worn denim and leather, his face weathered by sun and wind. He did not offer words of pity or ask questions. He simply knelt beside her. His hands, though large and calloused, moved with a surprising gentleness as he helped her collect her things. He picked up the photograph, a portrait of her late husband, and paused for a fraction of a second, his expression unreadable, before placing it carefully back in her hand. When everything was retrieved, he took the broken suitcase and examined the clasp. From a pouch on his belt, he produced a small, multifaceted tool with a few precise, efficient movements. He worked the bent metal, his focus absolute. He tested the latch. It held. He handed the suitcase back to her, his gaze meeting hers for a fleeting moment. His eyes were the color of a gathering storm, deep and shadowed. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked toward the livery stable without a word. Eleanor stood, clutching the handle of her repaired case, a strange mix of gratitude and unease settling over her. The silence he left behind was more profound than the whispers that now rippled through the small crowd. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked into the general store, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful, incongruous jingle. The interior smelled of coffee, cured meat, and dry goods. A woman with a face set in lines of permanent disapproval stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar. This was Mrs. Gable, the proprietor of the town's only boarding house. "I am Eleanor Weston," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The new schoolteacher. I was told I might find lodging here." Mrs. Gable stopped her polishing and gave Eleanor a slow, thorough appraisal, her eyes lingering on the plain gold band on Eleanor's finger before traveling up to her unadorned, travel-weary face. "A teacher. We were expecting a Mrs. Weston and her husband." "My husband passed," Eleanor said quietly. "I am a widow." The woman's expression tightened. "I see." She placed the jar down with a definitive click. "Well, that does complicate matters. We don't have accommodations for an unaccompanied lady. It wouldn't be proper." The lie was stark and cold, but no one else in the store dared to meet Eleanor's eyes. A few men shuffled their feet and found sudden interest in a barrel of nails. A woman at the far end of the counter turned her back completely. In an instant, Eleanor was an outcast, her status as a single woman a stain she could not wash away. She tried the hotel, a dusty, two-story building next to the saloon. The clerk, a young man with shifty eyes, told her they were full, though she could see a row of empty keys hanging on the wall behind him. She felt the weight of the town's collective judgment pressing down on her, as tangible as the afternoon heat. Desperation began to creep in, cold and sharp. She was alone, friendless, with nowhere to go. The carefully constructed plans for her new life crumbling into dust at her feet. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, she stood in the middle of the street, her trunk and suitcase at her feet, a solitary figure against the encroaching twilight. The wind picked up, whispering through the alleys, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and solitude. It felt like the loneliest place on earth. She did not hear him approach. One moment she was alone. The next he was standing a few feet away. The man from the livery, he had cleaned up, his face was washed, and he wore a cleaner shirt, though it was still simple and homespun. He gestured with his chin toward a small, dark shape of a cabin on the far edge of town, nestled against a low rise. "That cabin?" he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough around the edges, like he was not accustomed to using it. "It is mine, but I do not live there now. It is empty." Eleanor stared at him, wary. A woman alone did not accept such offers. Her mind screamed with the warning she had heard her entire life, but her reality was the cold, hard ground and the coming night. He seemed to read her thoughts, the conflict in her eyes. "There is a good well. The roof is sound. You can have the use of it." He paused, his gaze fixed on some point over her shoulder. "Only until the schoolhouse lodging is ready. It is better than the street." It was not an offer of charity, nor was it forward. It was a statement of fact, a practical solution to a practical problem. There was no warmth in his tone, but there was no judgment either. And in that moment, the absence of condemnation felt like the most profound kindness she had ever known. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Luke Mercer." She hesitated for only a second more, the last vestiges of her Eastern sensibilities warring with the harsh demands of the West. The West won. "I am Eleanor Weston, and I would be very grateful, Mr. Mercer." He simply nodded again, that same small, economical gesture. He lifted her heavy trunk with an ease that spoke of immense strength, settling it onto one shoulder. He picked up her suitcase with his other hand. "Come on, then," he said, and started walking, leaving her to follow his silhouette into the deepening dusk. The wind swirled the dust around her feet, a constant, restless presence. It stung her eyes, but it also served to hide the single tear that traced a clean path down her grimy cheek. It was the dust of the past, she thought, and the dust of the future, all mixed into one. And for now, it was all she had. The cabin was made of silence and shadows. Luke Mercer set her trunk down by the door with a soft thud that seemed to startle the dust motes dancing in the last rays of sunlight slanting through the single window. The air inside was cool and smelled of dry pine and cold ashes. It was a simple, one-room structure, the logs hand-hewn with a skill that spoke of patience and strength. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A narrow bed with a simple wool blanket was tucked into a corner, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the floor. It was a place stripped down to a man's barest needs. He showed her the well pump just outside the door, its iron handle cold to the touch. He worked it until clear, sweet water gushed forth. He pointed to a neatly stacked cord of wood against the cabin's outer wall. "The stove draws well," he said, his first full sentence to her. "The damper is on the left. Keep it halfway open once the fire is going." He placed her suitcase on the bed and turned to leave. His presence had filled the small space, and his absence left it feeling cavernous and empty. "Mr. Mercer," Eleanor called, her voice small. He paused in the doorway, his back to her. I do not know how to thank you." He stood there for a long moment, a dark silhouette against the deepening purple of the sky. "No thanks needed, ma'am," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Just be careful with the lamps." And then he was gone, melting into the twilight. That first night, Eleanor felt a profound and terrifying loneliness. She barred the heavy wooden door and lit a single kerosene lamp, its golden glow pushing back the shadows but not the silence. The wind moaned around the corners of the cabin, a mournful, restless sound that echoed the ache in her own heart. She unpacked her few belongings, placing her book on the small bedside table and setting the framed photograph of her husband beside it, a familiar ghost in this strange, new world. Her explorations were brief. There was little to see. A few tin plates and a cup on a shelf, a cast-iron skillet hanging by the hearth. But on the rough wooden mantelpiece, tucked behind a block of wood that served as a bookend for a tattered almanac, she found something else. It was a small, faded tin-type photograph. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the cool, smooth metal. It showed a woman with dark, gentle eyes and a soft smile, holding a small girl on her lap. The child, no more than 4 or 5, had a mischievous glint in her eyes and a halo of bright, unruly hair. They looked happy, their faces alight with a love that felt as real and warm as the lamplight in her hand. This was his house. This must have been his family. A wave of sorrow, sharp and unexpected, washed over her. Not for herself, but for the silent man who had given her shelter. She gently placed the photograph back in its hiding place, feeling like an intruder who had stumbled upon a sacred wound. The cabin was not empty, she realized. It was full of ghosts. Sleep did not come easily. She lay in the narrow bed, wrapped in a blanket that carried a faint, clean scent of wood smoke and sage, and listened to the alien sounds of the prairie night. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour, a sound from outside startled her awake. It was a voice, low and thick with sleep, but strained with a terrible anguish. She crept to the window and peered out. In the faint starlight, she could just make out a figure wrapped in a bedroll on the ground a short distance from her porch. It was Luke. He had not left her entirely alone, after all. He had been standing guard. He tossed in his sleep, his body tense. And then he spoke, his words a strangled cry that the wind almost carried away. "I did not mean to kill him. Anna, forgive me." A cold knot of fear tightened in Eleanor's stomach. She backed away from the window, her heart pounding. The quiet cowboy who had fixed her suitcase and offered her a roof was a man haunted by a violent past. She was a lone woman under the protection of a man who cried out about killing in his sleep. The fear was a rational, chilling thing, and yet, beneath it, something else stirred, a deep, aching pity for the profound pain in that broken whisper. The next few days passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. Each morning, Luke was gone before she rose. Occasionally, she would find a parcel on her porch steps, a sack of flour, a few potatoes, a piece of salted beef, left there like an offering from a shy spirit. The schoolhouse. She learned on a brief trip into town for other supplies. Was delayed. The lumber shipment was late. She was stranded in this limbo, a guest in a ghost house, reliant on a man who barely spoke to her. She needed a way to reclaim some small piece of her independence. One morning, when he brought a bucket of fresh milk from a nearby ranch, she was waiting for him on the porch. "Mr. Mercer," she said, stepping into his path before he could retreat. "I need to ask a favor." He stopped, his expression guarded. "What is it?" "I need to learn how to ride, properly, so that I can get to town on my own." He looked at her, then at the vast, open prairie that stretched out from her feet. He seemed to be weighing the request, or perhaps weighing her. "It is not like riding in a park in the East," he said, his tone flat. "I am aware," she replied, lifting her chin, "but I am a faster learner." He was silent for a long time, his stormy eyes studying her face. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. "Tomorrow, at sunrise." The next morning, he was there with a calm, older mare, its coat the color of honey. The saddle was a heavy, functional Western saddle, nothing like the delicate side saddles she was used to. He showed her how to check the cinch, how to hold the reins. His instructions were sparse, direct. "Let the horse feel your confidence. She will know if you are afraid." But she was afraid. The animal was large, the ground seemed very far away, and the world felt too wide, too open. She placed her foot in the stirrup, her hands gripping the saddle horn, but she could not bring herself to swing her other leg over. Her body was frozen with hesitation. She felt foolish, weak. "I have never done this before," she confessed, her voice small, her gaze fixed on her own trembling hands. It was an admission of more than just inexperience. It was an admission of her fear, her displacement, her utter reliance on him in that moment. She expected a sigh of impatience, a gruff word. Instead, she heard a soft sound. She looked up and saw that the hardness in his face had softened. A smile, faint and crooked, touched his lips for the very first time. It transformed his entire face, chasing away some of the shadows from his eyes. "Then let me show you," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He moved closer. One of his large hands gently covered hers on the saddle horn, his touch steady and warm. His other hand went to her back, a firm, reassuring pressure that was neither familiar nor improper. It was simply supportive. "Breathe," he said quietly. "Now, push up. I will not let you fall." And she believed him. In that moment, surrounded by an empty landscape with a man she barely knew, a man who harbored dark dreams, she trusted him completely. She pushed up, and his strength guided her, helped her swing her leg over the mare's back, and settled her into the deep leather seat. It felt strange, unsteady, but he kept his hand on her back until she found her balance. "Good," he said, stepping away. "Now, just walk her. Feel her move beneath you. Become part of her rhythm." He walked beside her as she nudged the mare forward, his presence a silent anchor in the vast, intimidating space. The fear did not vanish entirely, but it receded, replaced by a fragile, budding confidence. She was doing it. She was learning, and the man teaching her was no longer just a stranger or a source of fear. He was the one who had steadied her when she faltered, the one who had smiled and promised not to let her fall. For Eleanor, it felt like the first true sunrise since she had arrived in the West. For Luke, watching her, a forgotten warmth stirred in his chest, a flicker of light in a house long dark. He was helping someone again, and for the first time in years, it did not feel like a prelude to disaster. It felt like hope. A kind of unspoken treaty formed between them in the quiet days that followed. Eleanor practiced riding the honey-colored mare until the initial terror gave way to a steady, if cautious, confidence. The horse, patient and wise, seemed to understand her need. These rides became a lifeline, a way to traverse the vast, lonely landscape, and feel a measure of control. They also made it necessary for her to venture into Copper Creek for supplies, and it was there that the whispers began. They were like the dust, insidious and everywhere. She would feel them on the back of her neck as she walked into the general store, a sudden hush falling over the room, followed by a low murmur that would rise again the moment she turned her back. The women would draw together, their heads bent, their eyes darting towards her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The men would watch her with a different kind of speculation, their gazes lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. The words, when she managed to catch them, were sharp and ugly. The teacher, living out on the prairie, with him, that bounty hunter, Mercer. It was a simple, damning equation in their minds, and they had already solved it. The first open confrontation came on a Tuesday. Eleanor needed thread to mend a tear in her dress and went to the small fabric shop run by a formidable woman named Abigail Langley, Mrs. Langley was the self-appointed guardian of the town's virtue, a woman whose piety was as starched and severe as the bonnets she sold. As Eleanor stood at the counter, carefully selecting a spool of dark brown thread, Mrs. Langley leaned forward, her voice a loud, carrying whisper that was meant for the other two patrons in the store. "It is a shame," she began, her eyes like two small, hard stones, "what this town is coming to, when we cannot even trust the person hired to teach our children to set a proper moral example." Eleanor froze, the spool of thread suddenly heavy in her hand. She placed it on the counter and met the woman's gaze directly. "I am not sure I understand your meaning, Mrs. Langley." "Oh, I think you do," the woman sniffed, her thin lips tightening. "A widow, living unchaperoned in a man's house, a man like Luke Mercer, no less. It is a disgrace. You bring shame on yourself and on this town." The heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks, a fierce, burning humiliation. She could feel the eyes of the other women on her, their faces smug and censorious. For a moment, the old impulse to shrink away, to apologize, to flee, washed over her. But then she thought of Luke's quiet decency, the wood he stacked for her, the way he had guarded her through the night without ever speaking of it. She thought of his faint, rare smile. "Mr. Mercer," Eleanor said, her voice low but clear and steady, "offered me shelter when no one else in this town would. He has been a gentleman in every respect. What is truly a disgrace, madam, is a community that would leave a woman to sleep in the street and then condemn the one person who showed her Christian charity." She placed her coins on the counter for the thread, her hand perfectly still. "Mrs." Langley stared at her, momentarily stunned into silence by the directness of the rebuke. Eleanor picked up her purchase, gave a slight, formal nod to the other women, and walked out of the shop, her back ramrod straight, leaving a wake of shocked silence behind her. She did not allow herself to tremble until she was well clear of the town. Luke, for his part, was not immune to the town's judgment. One afternoon, as he was checking the shoes on his horse at the livery, Marshal Cole Avery approached him. The marshal was a man who wore his authority like a well-tailored coat, his silver star polished to a high sheen. He and Luke had a history, a fact that hung in the air between them, thick and unspoken. "Mercer," Avery said, his voice deceptively casual as he leaned against a support beam. "Heard the new school teacher is staying out at your old place." Luke did not stop his work, running a hand down the horse's leg. "She needed a roof." "Folks are talking," Avery continued, chewing on a piece of straw. "You know how it is. A man with your past, a woman on her own. It does not look good. For her." He paused, letting the implication settle. "I am just looking out for the town's well-being. And hers? A woman like that, she could pull you right back down into the mud you have been trying to climb out of." Luke finally straightened up and turned to face the marshal. His expression was flat, his eyes cold as a winter river. "What I do on my property is my business, Marshal, and the lady's welfare is my concern, not yours. You would do well to remember that." He turned back to his horse, a clear dismissal. Avery watched him for another moment, a flicker of something dark and unpleasant in his eyes, before he pushed himself off the beam and walked away. The tension came to a head a few days later. Eleanor's supplies were running low, and she rode into town with a list. As she was tying up the mare, Luke rode up beside her. He had been checking fence lines, he said, and thought he would accompany her. She felt a small, secret flutter of pleasure at his presence, a feeling of being protected. It was a foolish notion, she knew, but she could not help it. They went to the general store first. Then Eleanor needed to purchase some lamp oil, which was only sold at the saloon. She hesitated at the swinging doors, the sounds of rough laughter and clinking glasses spilling out into the street. It was no place for a lady. "I will get it," Luke said, seeing her hesitation. "Wait here." But she shook her head. "No, I will come with you." She would not hide. She would not let them make her feel ashamed. They stepped inside together. The saloon fell silent. Every eye turned to them, a hostile, unified stare. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies. They walked to the bar, the silence so complete that the sound of their boots on the wooden floor was like a drumbeat. The bartender, a large man with a stained apron, looked past Eleanor and fixed his gaze on Luke. He wiped the bar with a dirty rag. "We do not serve your kind here. Mercer." Luke stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the bar. His face was a mask, but Eleanor could see the muscle that jumped in his jaw. "I am not here for a drink. The lady needs lamp oil." "You are with him," the bartender sneered, turning his gaze to Eleanor. "That means you can take your business elsewhere, too." The collective judgment of the room felt like a physical blow. Eleanor looked at Luke's profile, at the rigid set of his shoulders, the deep, old pain that she could suddenly see etched around his eyes. He had been living with this, with their scorn and their fear, for years, and in that moment, something inside her broke free of its cage of propriety and fear. She stepped forward, placing her hands flat on the bar. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It rang with a clarity that cut through the thick, hateful silence. "This man," she said, her voice rising to fill the room, "is more of a gentleman than any of you. He has shown me kindness and decency when this town showed me nothing but a closed door. You refuse to serve him because of a past you know nothing about. Yet you will stand here and judge a woman you have never even spoken to. Who, exactly, is the sinner here?" She held their gazes, one by one, her chin high. No one moved. No one spoke. The bartender stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The men at the tables looked down at their cards or into their glasses. She had held up a mirror to their hypocrisy, and they could not bear to look at their own reflections. Eleanor turned to Luke. "Let us go," she said softly. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before, a raw, unguarded gratitude that stole her breath. He gave a single, curt nod to the silent room, and together they walked out of the saloon and back into the clean, bright sunlight. That night, the air in the cabin felt different. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with a new, comfortable understanding. As they sat at the small table, sharing a simple meal of beans and bread, Luke did something he had never done. He told a story about his childhood, a funny, self-deprecating tale about trying to tame a wild colt. And then he laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to come from a place long abandoned. Eleanor found herself laughing with him, a genuine, heartfelt laugh that made her feel lighter than she had in years. The sound was so foreign, so welcome, that it broke the last of the tension between them. She told him about her own quiet, bookish childhood, about her dream of being a teacher. They did not speak of their deepest wounds. Not yet. They did not mention her late husband or the tintype photograph on the mantel, but they shared their smaller, softer memories, weaving a fragile thread of connection in the warm lamplight. Later, after they had cleared the table, he went outside. When he returned, He was carrying a long, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. He placed it on the table and unwrapped it. It was a rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth with use, its steel barrel gleaming in the moonlight that streamed through the window. "The world out here is not always kind," he said, his voice quiet and serious. "A woman on her own needs to know how to protect herself." He took her outside, into the cool, silvered night. The moon was nearly full, illuminating the prairie with a soft, ethereal glow. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder. He stood behind her, his body close but not touching, his hands guiding hers as she learned the feel of the weapon. The rifle was heavy, a cold, solid weight in her arms. It was a symbol of the violence she feared, of the past that haunted him, but in his hands, and now in hers, under the calm, watchful eye of the moon. It also felt like something else. It felt like trust. It felt like the beginning of a promise. The trust that had taken root under the moonlight began to grow in the quiet spaces of the following days. The shooting lessons became a ritual, a silent conversation held in the vast emptiness of the prairie. Eleanor discovered a surprising steadiness in her hands and a keenness in her eye. Luke was a patient teacher, his instructions sparse but precise. He never praised her directly, but sometimes, after she hit a distant target, she would see a flicker of approval in his eyes, a small, quiet acknowledgement that felt more meaningful than any flowery compliment. During these lessons, the wall of silence that had so carefully guarded him began to show small cracks. He would point out the track of a coyote or the distant shadow of a hawk circling on a thermal. He spoke of the land not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a living thing to be understood, its moods and its dangers to be respected. He was a part of it, and in teaching her to survive in it, he was sharing a part of himself. One sweltering afternoon, when the air was heavy and still, promising a storm, Eleanor managed to hit 3 tin cans in a row from a considerable distance. She lowered the rifle, a small smile of pride on her face. "Were you ever a soldier, Mr. Mercer?" she asked, her curiosity finally overriding her caution. He had been watching her, his arms crossed over his chest. At her question, he went very still, the faint warmth in his expression vanishing like a snuffed candle. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where dark clouds were beginning to gather. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice flat. "I was never a soldier." The finality in his tone should have been a warning, but she felt a sudden, desperate need to understand the sadness that clung to him like a shroud. "But you handle a gun as if it were a part of you. You must have—" She trailed off, realizing she was prying. He was silent for a long time, so long that she thought he would not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, dredged up from a place of deep pain. "I was a bounty hunter, T." The words hung in the oppressive air between them. A bounty hunter. The name conjured images of cold-blooded men, of violence for profit. It was the name the townspeople spat at him like a curse. "I worked for Marshal Avery," he continued, his eyes still fixed on the horizon, as if he were watching a memory play out against the bruised sky. "When I first met my wife, Anna, all I wanted was to build a life for her. This cabin, a small herd. But ranching is a slow, hard business. Avery paid well. He said he needed men who could track, men who were not afraid. He said we were bringing injustice. For a while, I believed him." He finally turned to look at her, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound that she felt an answering ache in her own chest. "My job was to bring men in alive. That was the deal. But the men we hunted were desperate. Fights happened, and I was good at ending them. Too good. Anna, she hated it. She said it was changing me, hardening something inside me, but I saw the money as a way to give her and our little girl, Rose, a better life. I told myself it was for them." He stopped, swallowing hard. The first drop of rain, fat and heavy, splattered in the dust at their feet. There was a gang, he went on, his voice now barely a whisper. Avery wanted them badly. He set up an ambush at a dry creek bed. He told me to be there at noon. What he did not tell me was that he had provoked them, pushed them into a corner where they would come out fighting like cornered rats. What I did not know was that Anna and Rose were planning to surprise me, a picnic, for my birthday. They were coming down the other side of the ridge, right into the line of fire. The story spilled out of him then, a torrent of grief and guilt held back for too long. He spoke of the sudden eruption of gunfire, the chaos, the terrible, sickening realization that the wagon he saw splintering into pieces was his own. He spoke of running, of finding them, of a world that had ended in a single, brutal moment of noise and blood. Avery called it a tragedy. Luke finished, his voice raw with a grief that time had not touched. He said they were caught in the crossfire, but it was his ambush, his bad intelligence, his lie. After that, I was done. I put down my guns for good. But the name stuck. The town remembers the bounty hunter. They do not know about Anna. They do not know about Rose. He stood before her, stripped bare of all his defenses, his terrible secret laid at her feet. Eleanor's heart broke for him. She reached out without thinking and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were tense, hard as stone beneath her touch. She had no words of comfort that could possibly be enough. So she offered the only thing she had, a silent, shared understanding of loss. He looked down at her hand on his arm, his expression unreadable. The rain began to fall in earnest now, a cool sheet of water that plastered their clothes to their bodies and washed the dust from the air. "Let us get inside," she said softly. He nodded, and they ran for the cabin as the sky opened up, the thunder cracking directly overhead. Inside, the storm raged. Rain hammered against the roof and lashed at the window pane. The wind shrieked like a living thing. They stood in the dim light, dripping on the wooden floor. The silence between them now filled with his confession. To break the spell, Eleanor lit a lamp, its steady glow a small beacon against the fury of the storm. As she turned back to him, she saw him looking at the framed photograph of her husband on the bedside table. "You lost someone." "Two," he stated, his voice quiet. She nodded, twisting the simple gold band on her finger. "My husband, Arthur, he was a captain in the war. He died at Gettysburg." "He was a hero," Luke said. It was not a question. A bitter smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Yes, that is what everyone said." She took a deep breath, the scent of the rain and the wet earth filling her lungs. His honesty demanded her own, and that is why I had to leave my home. She told him everything. She spoke of the stifling propriety of her life in Philadelphia, of the suffocating grief after Arthur's death. She spoke of her in-laws, a cold, pious family who had never truly approved of her. And she spoke of the letters. After Arthur died, his family was supposed to manage his estate until I came of age. But they wanted it all for themselves. They needed a way to discredit me. A friend of Arthur's, a kind man who was also a doctor, wrote to me a few times to see how I was faring. His letters were full of nothing but sympathy and concern, but my brother-in-law found them. He presented them to the family, to the whole church congregation, as proof that I was unfaithful to the memory of their heroic son. The shame of it, the raw injustice, was still a fresh wound. They did not need proof. They only needed a whisper. A woman in mourning, receiving letters from a man. It was enough. I was judged and condemned in a single afternoon. My good name was destroyed. I had no inheritance, no home, no future. Coming west, becoming a teacher. It was the only escape I could think of. They looked at each other across the small, lamp-lit room. The storm a distant roar. Two strangers from different worlds, bound by the same invisible chains. Both of them had been branded by lies, exiled by the judgment of others. They were victims of stories they did not write. Suddenly, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the cabin to its foundations. followed by the sound of splintering wood and a cascade of water. A section of the roof near the hearth had given way, and rain was pouring in. Luke sprang into action, grabbing the heavy wooden table and dragging it under the leak to catch the worst of the deluge in a bucket. A branch must have come down on the roof. He yelled over the roar of the storm, "I have to secure it, or we will lose the whole section." He grabbed a hammer and a handful of nails and unbarred the door. "Stay inside," he ordered. But Eleanor watched as he climbed onto a crate, struggling against the wind and the driving rain to reach the damaged shingles. The wind tore at him, threatening to pull him from his precarious perch. Without a second thought, she was out the door and in the storm beside him, holding a loose plank of wood steady so that he could nail it into place. The rain blinded her. The wind stole her breath. But she held on, her small strength added to his. Just as he hammered the last nail into place, a powerful gust of wind ripped the plank from her grasp. It cartwheeled through the air, and a corner of it struck her arm as it flew past. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and stumbled back, clutching her forearm. Luke was down in an instant, his hands on her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he shouted, his face inches from hers, his eyes dark with concern. "It is just a scratch," she said, though a sharp, stinging pain was radiating up her arm. He guided her back inside, into the relative quiet of the cabin. The leak was reduced to a steady drip. He barred the door, shutting out the storm, and led her to the lamplight. He gently took her arm. A long, shallow gash ran from her wrist to her elbow, welling with blood. He said nothing. He went to a small chest in the corner and took out a clean cloth and a bottle of whiskey. He poured some of the liquor onto the rag, and the sharp, antiseptic smell filled the air. "This will sting," he said, his voice low and gentle. He began to clean the wound, his touch surprisingly deft, his calloused fingers infinitely tender against her skin. Eleanor watched his face, his brow furrowed in concentration. In that moment, he was not a bounty hunter, not a haunted man. He was just a man, caring for her. When the cut was clean, he looked around, then simply tore a long, clean strip from the bottom of his own shirt. He wrapped it carefully around her arm, his hands warm and steady. He tied it off, his fingers brushing against her pulse. He did not let go. His hand remained, his thumb resting on the inside of her wrist. He looked up, and his eyes met hers. The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with all the words they had finally spoken and all the feelings they had not. The storm outside had passed its peak, its fury softening into a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. Slowly, hesitantly, he leaned in. It was not a gesture of passion or of demand. It was a question, a movement of infinite, aching tenderness. He gave her every chance to turn away, but she did not move. She leaned into him, her eyes fluttering closed. The kiss was as soft as the lamplight, as gentle as the falling rain. It was the taste of solace, the breaking of a fever. It was the quiet, profound relief of two lonely, wounded souls finding a safe harbor in a storm. It was not about desire. It was about recognition. It was about seeing the scars in another person and finding in them a reflection of your own. It was a coming home, a silent promise that neither of them had to be alone in the dark anymore. The world felt new in the morning light. The storm had scoured the air clean, leaving behind the sweet, earthy scent of wet sage and pine. Inside the cabin, a quiet intimacy lingered, as fragile and as precious as the new day. They moved around each other with a gentle awareness, the space between them no longer a chasm of unspoken words, but a comfortable silence, warmed by the memory of a shared confidence and a healing touch. For the first time since Eleanor had arrived in this hard, unforgiving land, she did not feel entirely alone. Hope, she discovered, was a quiet thing, a gentle warmth in the center of her chest. But hope had little currency in Copper Creek. Marshall Cole Avery was a man who traded in fear and secrets. His own past was a carefully constructed fortress, and he patrolled its walls with a sleepless vigilance. A few days after the storm, while sorting the incoming mail pouch, a name on a letter forwarded from Philadelphia snagged his attention: Miss Eleanor Weston. The name, coupled with the city, stirred a disquieting memory, a faint alarm bell from a life he had long since buried. He made a discreet inquiry, sending a telegram to an old associate back east under the guise of official business. The reply came 2 days later, and as Avery read the coded message, the blood drained from his face. Eleanor Weston was not just a grieving widow. A decade earlier, as a very young woman, she had been a key witness in a sensational fraud trial involving a powerful shipping magnate. Her testimony, clear and unshakable, had been instrumental in convicting one of the junior partners. Avery, in those days, had been little more than a hired gun, a private enforcer for the magnate. His job had been intimidation and ensuring certain evidence disappeared. He had seen the young witness in court, a slip of a girl with honest eyes, never imagining their paths would cross again. Her presence here, in his town, under his jurisdiction, was a lit fuse. If she ever recognized him, if she ever made the connection, his entire life, his authority, his very identity as a lawman, could be destroyed. He had to neutralize her, but he was the marshal. He could not simply ride out to the cabin and put a bullet in her. His power was built on the perception of law, of order. He had to use the town's own poison against her. He had to ruin her so completely that no one would ever believe a word she said. He knew exactly where to plant the seed. He found Abigail Langley sweeping the boardwalk in front of her fabric shop. He tipped his hat, his expression grave and concerned. He spoke in a low, confidential tone about a troubling report he had received from the authorities back east concerning the new schoolteacher. He used vague but suggestive language, speaking of a sordid past, of a reputation that had forced her to flee Philadelphia. He mentioned her association with a man like Luke Mercer as sad but unsurprising confirmation. He was just a lawman, he said, concerned for the moral fiber of the community and the safety of its children. He knew Mrs. Langley would do the rest. And she did. The lie, given the weight of the marshal's authority, took root and grew with monstrous speed. It was no longer just whispers about an improper living arrangement. The story became that Eleanor Weston was a woman of low character, a professional deceiver who had come west to ply her trade. Each telling embellished the tale, adding sordid, imaginary details. Eleanor felt the change almost immediately. The cold shoulders she had grown used to became open hostility. When she went into the general store, Mrs. Gable refused to serve her, turning her back without a word. Children who had previously looked at her with shy curiosity were now yanked away by their mothers, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. The looks from the men in town changed from speculation to a leering, possessive appraisal that made her feel soiled. The final blow came in the form of a letter delivered by a grim-faced boy. It was from the school committee, a hastily assembled board of the town's most prominent citizens. Her services, the letter stated, would not be required. The schoolhouse lodging would be given to a new teacher, a man with a family, who was already on his way. The reason given was her untenable moral position within the community. She sat at the small table in the cabin, the letter trembling in her hand, the cruel words blurring through her tears. It was happening all over again. The same judgment, the same condemnation based on lies. She had run 1,000 miles, only to find herself trapped in the exact same prison. When Luke returned from a long ride checking on a neighbor's stray cattle, he found her there, her face pale, her eyes hollow with despair. He read the letter, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. He looked at Eleanor, at the fresh pain etched on her face, and something broke inside him. It was the quiet dam of restraint he had built around his heart for years. "It is Avery," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "This has his stink all over it." "What can we do?" Eleanor whispered, her voice choked with defeat. They will not listen. They have already decided who I am. They will listen to me, he said. He took his gun belt, which had been hanging from a peg on the wall, and strapped it around his hips. The weight of it seemed to settle on him, transforming him from the quiet ranch hand back into the man he once was. But there was a difference. Before, he had worn the gun for money, for a false sense of justice. Now, he wore it for her. "Luke, no," she pleaded, rising to her feet. "Violence will not solve this. It will only prove them right." "There are some lies," he said, his hand resting on the worn leather holster, "that you cannot fight with words." He looked at her, his eyes full of a fierce, protective light. "I will not let them do this to you. I will not let him win." He walked out into the late afternoon, the sky already beginning to bruise with the threat of another storm. Eleanor watched him go. Her heart seized with a terrible fear. She could not lose him. Not now. Not when she had just found him. She grabbed her shawl and ran after him. The confrontation happened in the center of town, in the wide, dusty street between the saloon and the marshal's office. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the palpable tension in the air. Marshal Avery stood on the boardwalk, a smug, confident smile on his face, his silver star gleaming on his chest. Luke stood in the street, alone, a solitary figure of quiet rage against the backdrop of the hostile town. "Avery!" Luke called out, his voice carrying in the heavy, humid air. "You have something to say about this lady. Say it to me." Avery laughed. "A short, ugly sound. I have nothing to say to you. Mercer, I am a lawman. I deal in facts. The fact is, the schoolteacher has a past, and this town has a right to know who they are letting near their children." "You are a liar," Luke said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You are the one with a past to hide, and you are using her to protect yourself." Avery's smile faltered. A flicker of alarm crossed his face. "You are drunk, Mercer, or crazy. I suggest you go home before you get yourself into trouble you cannot get out of." "The only trouble here is you," Luke said, taking a step forward. "You destroyed my life once, Avery. You will not do it again." It was then that Avery saw Eleanor, hurrying down the street, her face stricken with fear. He saw his problem, the source of his potential ruin. A venomous look twisted his features. He made a move, not for the gun on his hip, but a step off the boardwalk, a step towards her. "This is what happens when you let trash into town." He spat, his hand twitching. That was all it took. In the space of a heartbeat, the world seemed to slow down. Luke saw the threat, the naked aggression in Avery's eyes directed at Eleanor, the years of grief, the simmering rage, the fierce, protective love he felt for her, all coalesced into a single, clarifying purpose. His hand moved, a blur of motion. The gun was in his hand, roaring to life before Avery's had even cleared its holster. But the shot was not aimed at the silver star. It was not aimed at the heart. Luke had Avery dead to rights, a perfect silhouette against the darkening sky. He saw Anna's face in his mind, heard her voice worrying about the man he was becoming. He saw Eleanor, her face a pale oval of terror. He could kill Avery, he could have his revenge. But he chose something else. His bullet struck Avery's right hand with the surgical precision. The gun flew from the marshal's grasp, clattering into the dust. Avery cried out, a shriek of pain and shock. Clutching his shattered hand, the crowd gasped. They had expected a killing. They had just witnessed an act of mercy. But mercy was a language Cole Avery did not speak. His face contorted with hate. He fumbled for the second pistol tucked into his belt with his left hand. He was not a gunman, not a duelist. He was a cornered animal. He raised the weapon, firing wildly. Luke had already started to turn, his purpose fulfilled. He had disarmed the threat, not eliminated the man. The bullet caught him high in the side, spinning him around. A look of surprise crossed his face. Then his legs buckled. He fell to his knees, then pitched forward into the street, just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. For a moment, The town was frozen, a tableau of shock and horror. Then, Eleanor's scream broke the spell. She ran, heedless of the rain that was now coming down in a steady, determined sheet. She fell to her knees in the mud beside Luke, gathering his head and shoulders into her lap. His blood, dark and warm, was already soaking through his shirt, mingling with the rain, turning the dust around them into a crimson slurry. She held him, her face buried in his hair, her body shielding him from the storm. As the town looked on in stunned silence, the bounty hunter had shot to wound, the lawman had shot to kill, and in the middle of the street, cradled in the arms of the woman he had defended, the true meaning of justice lay bleeding in the rain. The chaos of the gunshot gave way to a stunned, rain-soaked silence. For a long moment, the people of Copper Creek stood frozen, witnesses to a truth so plain and brutal it shattered their long-held prejudices. They had seen Luke Mercer, the feared bounty hunter, choose mercy. They had seen Marshall Avery, the symbol of their law, choose murder in the muddy street, with Eleanor's desperate sobs cutting through the downpour. The town's entire moral compass spun and found a new, terrible north. It was the town's physician, a stoic, weary man named Dr. Miller, who broke the spell. He pushed through the crowd, his black bag in hand. "Get him inside," he commanded, his voice a gravelly authority that no one dared question. "Someone help me, now!" It was not the sheriff's men, but the townspeople themselves who moved, the blacksmith and the general store owner, men who had shunned Luke only hours before, gently lifted his unconscious form. Mrs. Gable, the boarding house proprietor whose doors had been firmly closed to Eleanor, ran ahead, calling out, "Bring him to my place. The back room is clean and quiet." As they carried him, a strange procession through the rain, Eleanor stayed by his side, her hand never leaving his, her face a mask of fierce, protective grief. They laid him on a narrow bed, and Dr. Miller went to work, cutting away the blood-soaked shirt. The bullet had gone clean through, high on his left side, a wound that was both a blessing and a curse. It had missed his heart, but the loss of blood was severe. I saw it all. The doctor grumbled as he worked, speaking as much to the room as to himself. Saw it from my window. Mercer had him dead to rights, shot the gun from his hand. "Clean as you please. Avery is no lawman. He is a coward." That single authoritative statement rippled through the onlookers, giving voice to what they had all witnessed. It was permission to believe their own eyes over years of ingrained fear and rumor. The days that followed were a long, feverish blur. Luke hovered between life and death, his breathing shallow, his body consumed by fever. Eleanor became his anchor to the living world. She did not leave his side. She bathed his face with cool water, spooned broth between his parched lips, and changed the bandages with a steady hand, following the doctor's instructions to the letter. She spoke to him in low, soothing tones, reading from her book of sonnets or simply telling him about the sky outside, her voice a constant, gentle presence in the dim, quiet room. And the town, in its own clumsy, heartfelt way, began to atone. The people of Copper Creek, who had so recently condemned them both, now became their silent guardians. Mrs. Gable left trays of food outside the door. Abigail Langley, the woman who had publicly shamed Eleanor, appeared one afternoon with a stack of finely woven linen bandages and a jar of healing salve, her face etched with a shame that was more eloquent than any apology. The blacksmith sat by Luke's bed for 2 nights straight, a silent, hulking presence, just so Eleanor could finally get a few hours of uninterrupted sleep in a nearby chair. They did not speak of what had happened, but their actions were a clear and profound confession of their own guilt. A circuit judge arrived a week later. The inquiry was short, with a dozen eyewitnesses all telling the same story. Cole Avery was stripped of his badge and charged with attempted murder. He was taken away in irons, a sullen, defeated man, his reign of quiet terror over Copper Creek finally at an end. As Luke's fever broke and he began the slow, arduous climb back to consciousness. Eleanor found a new purpose. The school committee, led by a deeply humbled mayor, had come to her and begged her to reconsider. They offered her the official position, the schoolhouse, a full salary. She thanked them, but politely declined. Instead, she rented a small, unused storeroom at the edge of town, near the cabin. She scrubbed it clean, and with a few benches and a chalkboard donated by the repentant town, she started her school. The children came, their faces bright with curiosity. She taught them reading and arithmetic, but she also taught them about kindness and courage. Her lessons infused with a wisdom forged in pain. The classroom became a small, bright pocket of hope, and her work there was a balm to her own soul. Every afternoon, after dismissing her pupils, she would walk back to Luke, her heart lighter, her purpose renewed. One day, the mail carrier brought her a letter, its envelope a crisp, unfamiliar white, the postmark from Philadelphia. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was from her late husband's eldest sister. The words were stilted, full of regret. Her brother-in-law, it seemed, had been caught in a far grander deception, a disastrous business venture that had bankrupted the family. His lies had unraveled, and with them, the lies he had told about Eleanor. The family offered their deepest, most sincere apologies. They invited her to return home, to reclaim her name and a small portion of what was left of her inheritance. She read the letter twice, a year ago. These words would have been a lifeline, a vindication she had desperately craved. She would have wept with relief. Now, she felt a strange and hollow calm. She thought of the cold, judgmental faces of her in-laws, of a life lived in hushed drawing rooms and suffocating corsets. She looked out the window at the vast, open prairie, at the endless sky. She looked at Luke, asleep in the bed, his breathing slow and even, his scarred hand resting on the quilt. That evening, she went out to the cabin. Luke was well enough now to spend his days there, slowly regaining his strength. She found him sitting on the porch, watching the sun set. The sky was a breathtaking spectacle of orange, pink, and deep purple, the colors bleeding into one another across the horizon. She sat in the chair beside him, the letter in her hand. "It is from Philadelphia," she said quietly. "From my husband's family. They have apologized. They want me to come home." Luke turned to look at her, his face calm, his gaze searching hers. He said nothing, waiting for her to continue. He would not ask her to stay. He would not influence her decision. He had already taken enough from her. Eleanor looked at the piece of paper, at the elegant script that represented a life that no longer felt like hers. It was a ghost, a final tie to a past that had caused her nothing but pain. With a steady hand, she lit the corner of the letter from the flame of the lantern on the porch rail. The paper caught, curling into a black ash, the words of apology turning to smoke and drifting away into the twilight. She had her vindication, not in their words, but in the life she was building here. This was her home now. She let the last of the ash fall from her fingers and took a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket. "One of my students wrote something today," she said, her voice soft in the growing dusk. The topic was courage. She unfolded the paper and began to read, her voice the only sound besides the chirping of the crickets. "Some people think courage is a big horse and a fast gun." She read, "They think it is about winning fights and never being scared, but I think courage is a quiet thing. It is helping someone when everyone else is throwing stones. It is telling the truth when it is easier to lie. My teacher says true courage does not come from a gun. It comes from the heart, and it is what makes us kind." When she finished, she folded the paper and looked at Luke. Tears were glistening in his eyes, catching the last of the fading sunlight. He reached out and took her hand, his grip still weak but full of a profound, unspoken gratitude. They sat there together in the peaceful twilight, their hands clasped, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon. The dust had settled, the storm had passed, and in the quiet heart of the unforgiving West, They had found their peace. The fierce heat of summer had gentled into the golden melancholy of autumn. The cottonwood trees along the creek turned a brilliant, shimmering yellow, and the air, especially in the mornings, carried a crisp, clean bite. Months had passed. Luke's recovery had been slow but complete. He moved with his old, easy strength, the deep scar on his side a pale, silvery line that was the only physical reminder of that violent afternoon. He worked with a quiet purpose, mending the fences on his small property, tending to his 2 horses, and adding a small, sturdy extension to the back of the cabin. It was to be a proper schoolroom, he had decided, with a large window to let in the light. Their life together had settled into a rhythm as natural and as comforting as the changing seasons. It was a partnership forged not in grand declarations, but in the small, everyday acts of living. It was in the way she would leave a hot plate of food for him when he was working late, and the way he would have a fire blazing in the hearth when she returned, chilled, from her schoolhouse at dusk. It was a language of shared glances across the dinner table, of comfortable silence on the porch as they watched the stars emerge, of the way he would look up from his work when he heard the sound of her horse approaching. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He was no longer the town's outcast, and she was no longer the disgraced widow. They were simply Luke and Eleanor, a fixed point in the town's slowly healing consciousness. The proposal, when it came, was as simple and as direct as the man himself. They were walking by the creek one Sunday afternoon, the water burbling over the smooth stones. He stopped and took her hand, turning her to face him. His own hand was warm and calloused, completely enfolding hers. "Eleanor," he said, his voice the low, steady rumble she had come to love. "I think we should be married." It was not a question so much as a statement of an undeniable truth. It was the natural, inevitable culmination of everything they had endured and everything they had become to one another. She looked up into his eyes, those stormy eyes that were now so often clear and calm, and saw her own reflection there. She saw her home. "Yes, Luke," she whispered, her heart so full it felt as though it might burst. "Yes, I think we should." They were married a week later, on a perfect autumn day. The ceremony was held in that same spot by the creek, under the golden canopy of the cottonwood leaves. It was a small gathering. Dr. Miller was there, his gruff demeanor softened by a genuine smile. Mrs. Gable came, bearing a large, fragrant spice cake as a wedding gift, and Eleanor's small clutch of students stood in a neat, scrubbed line, their faces shining with excitement, each of them holding a small, hand-picked bouquet of wildflowers. The circuit preacher, a kind man with a booming voice, performed the service. Eleanor wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Langley had insisted on sewing for her, a quiet, tangible act of penance and of friendship. Luke stood beside her, tall and solid, dressed in a clean shirt and his best trousers, his gaze never leaving her face. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, their promises unadorned but deeply felt, their words mingling with the sound of the creek and the rustle of the autumn leaves. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Luke gently lifted her veil. He did not kiss her with a triumphant passion, but with a deep, reverent tenderness that was a promise all its own. That evening, they returned to the cabin. As they approached the small porch, Luke stopped. Before she could ask why, he bent down and swept her up into his arms. She gave a small cry of surprise, her arms instinctively going around his neck. "It is tradition," he said, a rare, boyish grin lighting up his face in the soft glow of the lantern she had left burning in the window. He carried her over the threshold and gently set her down inside. The cabin was their sanctuary. He had built a warm fire in the hearth, and its light danced on the familiar wooden walls, making the small space feel intimate and safe. A simple meal was laid out on the table, and the narrow bed in the corner had been made up with fresh, clean linens that smelled faintly of lavender. They ate slowly, speaking in low tones, their conversation punctuated by long, comfortable silences. But underneath the calm, a new current of awareness flowed between them, a quiet, nervous anticipation that was both thrilling and terrifying. When the meal was over, Eleanor rose and went to the window, her back to him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked out at the moonlit prairie, at the vast, silent expanse that had once seemed so threatening and now felt like a protective embrace. She heard him come to stand behind her. He did not touch her, but she could feel the warmth of his body, the steady strength of his presence. "Eleanor," he asked softly. She turned to face him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. In the flickering firelight, his face was a landscape of shadows and warmth, his eyes dark with an emotion she could not quite name. It was love, she knew, but it was also something more, something deeper. It was reverence. This moment was the culmination of everything. It was the final, quiet healing of all their wounds. Her marriage to Arthur had been a union of duty and quiet affection, a partnership of two young people playing the roles expected of them. It had been cut short before it had ever had a chance to truly blossom into a deeper intimacy. She was a widow, but in the truest, most profound sense, she was an innocent. The idea of this final, complete joining with Luke, this total surrender of body and soul, was a terrifying, uncharted territory. She took a shaky breath, her gaze dropping from his. "I have never done this before," she whispered, the words barely audible. It was a confession of a vulnerability so deep it felt like she was laying her very soul bare at his feet. It was not just about the physical act, it was about this, about a love born from truth and turmoil, about giving herself to a man who had seen every scar, every flaw, and had loved her not in spite of them, but because of them. He did not laugh or seem surprised. He simply reached out and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. And then he smiled, that same slow, crooked smile that had first broken through his defenses on the day he taught her to ride. It was a smile full of understanding, of patience, and of a love so profound it made her want to weep. "Then let me show you," he said, his voice a low, gentle murmur that soothed the frantic beating of her heart. He led her to the bed, his movements unhurried, his touch infinitely gentle. Every gesture was a reassurance, every look a promise. He did not take, he invited. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding, a quiet lesson in trust. When their bodies finally met, it was not with a clash of passion, but with the soft, perfect alignment of two souls who had been searching for each other their entire lives. It was the erasing of the ghosts of their separate pasts, a joining of two solitudes into a single, unified warmth. It was a quiet prayer in the heart of the wilderness, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of landscapes, the most beautiful and fragile things could not only survive, but flourish. The final, quiet surrender was not a loss, but a discovery, the finding of a part of herself she never knew was missing. Wrapped in his arms, in the quiet warmth of the firelight, Eleanor Weston Mercer finally, truly, came home. Another year turned, cycling through the stark white silence of winter and the muddy, tentative green of spring, before settling once more into the long, golden days of summer. The cabin was no longer just a cabin, but the heart of a small, thriving homestead. The new schoolroom Luke had built was filled 5 days a week with the shuffling feet and eager voices of Copper Creek's children. Eleanor had discovered a deep and abiding joy in her work, in watching young minds open up like prairie flowers after a rain. Her reputation as a teacher was one of kindness and wisdom, and the same parents who had once pulled their children away from her now sought her counsel and praised her name. Luke's herd of cattle had grown, their dun-and-roan hides dotting the landscape. He worked from sunup to sundown, the physical labor a welcome balm that had completely restored his strength and quieted the last of his ghosts. The townsfolk now greeted him with a respect that was deep and genuine. They saw him not as the bounty hunter of their fears, but as the man who had shown them the true meaning of courage. He and Eleanor were no longer curiosities or outcasts. They were the bedrock of the community, a quiet, steadfast symbol of how even the most broken things could be made whole again. Their love was a simple, sturdy thing, woven into the fabric of their days, a quiet strength that was the envy and the admiration of all who saw it. Life had found a peaceful, steady rhythm. Then, in late July, a covered wagon, part of a small train heading for the Oregon territories, broke an axle just outside of town. It was a common enough occurrence, but this wagon carried a sickness with it, a fever, swift and merciless, had taken the young husband a week before. It took his wife 2 days after they arrived in Copper Creek. Despite Dr. Miller's best efforts, they left behind a small, silent girl of about 5 years old, a child with enormous, terrified eyes and hair the color of corn silk. She had not spoken a word since her mother had passed. The town was sympathetic but practical. Times were hard, and an extra mouth to feed was a serious burden. The child, whose name was Sarah, was housed temporarily with the blacksmith's family, but it was understood that a more permanent solution would have to be found, perhaps an orphanage in a larger city further down the line. Eleanor's heart ached for the little girl. She began visiting her every afternoon, bringing a small picture book or a piece of candy. She did not press the child to speak, but simply sat with her, her presence a calm and steady offering. The child would watch her, her gaze wary and full of a sorrow too large for her small frame. Luke, however, kept his distance. He was kind, his eyes full of a pained sympathy when he saw the little girl in town. But he would not go near her. Eleanor understood. The child was a ghost. She was the same age his Rose had been. To open his heart to this child would be to open that old, deep wound to the fresh air, and he did not know if he could bear it. The scar was healed, but the memory of the injury was still a tender place in his soul. One afternoon, Eleanor could not find the little girl at the blacksmith's home. A quiet panic set in. The whole town began to search, calling her name. It was Luke who found her. He had known, with a certainty that came from his own wounded heart, where a lost and frightened creature would go to hide. He found her in the hayloft of the livery stable, curled up in the farthest, darkest corner, trying to make herself invisible. He did not call out to her. He simply climbed the ladder and sat on a bale of hay a respectful distance away. The air was warm and smelled of sweet grass and horses. He said nothing for a long time. Then, he took a small block of pine and his whittling knife from his pocket. He began to carve, the blade moving with a familiar, practiced grace. Slowly, a shape emerged from the wood. A small, perfect horse, its head arched, its tail flowing. He worked in silence for nearly an hour. When he was finished, he sanded the figure smooth with a piece of leather and held it out on his open palm, placing it on the hay between them. He did not look at her, but kept his gaze fixed on the sunbeams slanting through the cracks in the wall. After a long, silent moment, a small, grimy hand crept out from the shadows and hesitantly took the wooden horse. Luke did not move. He just sat there, breathing quietly, until he felt a tiny weight press against his arm. She had moved closer, her small head resting against his bicep, her fingers clutching the small toy. It was the first time she had willingly touched another person since her parents had died. That night, Luke spoke of his fear. They sat on the porch, the crickets singing their nightly chorus. "I look at her, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and strained, "and I see Rose. I see everything I lost, everything I failed to protect. I do not know if I have the strength to risk that again." Eleanor took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "Loving is always a risk. Luke," she said softly, "there are no guarantees, but you did not fail Rose. A terrible thing happened, and it was not your fault. You have carried that burden long enough." She paused, squeezing his hand. "Loving this child is not about replacing the one you lost. It is about honoring her. It is about choosing to let your heart be a place of love and life, not just a monument to what is gone. It is the bravest thing you could possibly do. He was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the star-dusted darkness. Then he nodded. A slow, resolute movement. "What shall we call her?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor smiled through her tears. "I think," she said, "that she looks like a rose." They adopted her the next week. The process was simple, the town's approval unanimous and heartfelt. The first time the little girl spoke, it was to Luke. He was lifting her onto his horse, and her small arms went around his neck. "Papa," she whispered into his collar, the word a fragile, precious gift. And in that moment, the last of the ice around Luke's heart melted away for good. A year later, on a warm evening in late summer, the three of them rode out onto the prairie. Rose sat before Luke on his saddle, her small back resting against his chest, her laughter like tiny bells as their horse trotted along. Eleanor rode beside them on her honey-colored mare, a serene and happy smile on her face. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by courage, by loss, and by a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of places. Luke looked at Eleanor, her face bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, and his heart was full. He looked down at the bright head of the child in his arms, a child who had brought life and laughter back into the silent corners of his soul. He had not forgotten his past. The ghosts of his first Anna and his first Rose would always be a part of him, a sad, sweet melody in the back of his memory. But now, there was a new song, a vibrant and hopeful harmony that played over it. Love, he knew, did not erase the past. It simply gave you the courage to build a future alongside it. As they turned for home, a gentle breeze swept across the plains, stirring up the fine, red dust of the earth. It coated their clothes and settled on their skin, a familiar presence in this vast, wild land. The wind carried dust, but this time, it smelled like home. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the heart of the West. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And if you enjoyed our story, please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video, and press the hype button to help share it with more listeners.